Thank you very much for coming. I want to talk to you about the power of the mind and how the muscles of our minds can be improved by books, in particular fiction. And I wanted to talk, to begin with, about Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. I don't know how many people have read Anna Karenina. It's one of the great books. But there's a tiny, tiny scene in the middle of Anna Karenina. As you know, she's decided to embark on this disastrous relationship with Vronsky, and she's run away from home and she's taken her little boy with her. And the husband wants her to send the boy back, and she realises she has to. And this has broken her heart, the idea that she's going to lose her little boy. And she considers whether to tell Vronsky, her lover, about the pain she's feeling. And she thinks about this, and she realises that if she does, a dismissive look will pass across Vronsky's face, and that once she sees that dismissive look, she won't be able to love him anymore, and the whole thing will fall apart. And she's given up so much, it turns out, for nothing. And so she decides to say nothing to her lover. And it's about 4 lines of text. But as you read these 4 lines of text, you wonder how Tolstoy understands the human character so well, how he can see into the soul of this woman. And you become completely overwhelmed by a desire to embrace Anna and hold her tight. You're so totally walking in her shoes. There's 3 or 4 lines of text, and you realise that, we understand suddenly what this affair has cost her. We understand that nothing's going to make it better. And we understand that she realises this too. It's this devastating moment. And in that devastating moment, by this point in the novel, we don't even like her that much. We read that she's a prissy princess in a way. We don't even like her. She's not a member of our social class. She's a kind of Russian aristocrat. She's not a member of our century. She's not a member of our country. And yet, this beautifully written scene of 5 or 6 lines makes us want to reach across the centuries and embrace her tight. And it's a wonderful example of what fiction does, the way it strengthens our muscles for seeing the world through each other's eyes. Good fiction, like Anna Karenina, is like this gymnasium of empathy. It's the way we strengthen our ability to walk in each other's shoes. And there are so many examples you can think of in the world of books whereby you tumble into somebody else's world, that these books work as trapdoors into other people's lives, and you suddenly find yourself walking the streets of Melbourne with a beggar, or working as a barista in Mumbai. You suddenly see the world through other people's eyes. There's been a couple of really good autobiographies recently by female British writers, and both of them talk about the role of the book in kind of saving them, in saving their lives. One is a book by Caitlin Moran called How to Be a Woman. It's a fabulous book, and it tells the story of growing up in a very poor council flat in the north of England, one of 7 siblings, I think, and how she was entirely sort of alienated and lonely and distressed. And then she came across the local library. And she talks about the local library as being like the cavalry which came running into her life. She says, epaulets shining and spurs jangling, the library came into my life. And she walked into this library and realised that, friendless though she felt at age 15, that in a library there were 1,000 people who wanted to talk to you. All you had to do was open their book, and they wanted to speak to you. And even more excitingly, and I think this is something that every book reader will understand, that every book has a friend it wants to introduce you to. So you start with George Orwell, and George Orwell wants to introduce you to Aldous Huxley. And then Aldous Huxley wants to introduce you to either Evelyn Waugh or Ursula Le Guin. And if you're introduced to Ursula Le Guin, she in turn will introduce you to Margaret Atwood. And every book has a friend it wants to introduce you to. The other book is by Jeanette Winterson, who's come to Australia recently for the Sydney Writers' Festival. It's got this fabulous title, if you haven't heard it. The title, it's an autobiography called Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal? And it tells the story. She grew up she was adopted into a really weird Pentecostal family. I've got nothing against Pentecostals, but this family, the mother thought this new baby was the devil who had been sent to torment her. It was an awful, awful story. And finally, Jeanette grows up and she decides to leave home. She comes out as gay, and she tells her mother she's going to Oxford and she's going to be gay. And And the mother says, why be normal when you could be happy? So that's her story, but how does the book operate in that story? Well, the book, again, it's the local library. She wanders in, very alienated, this terrible family life. And she decides to do English literature from A to Z. She works her way through those shelves in the library, and she says in the book, actually, English literature from A to Z turns out to be a good idea because you get Jane Austen fairly early on. So you get this enormous treat early on. And she reads through all the books, and she finally gets to Nabokov, Lolita. And the spiky feminist that Jeanette Winterson still is hated Lolita and thought it was sexist and dreadful and sleazy, and she sort of threw it back to the librarian and said, I'm giving up English literature from A to Z. I'm not reading anymore. And this very smart librarian said, come on, Jeanette, let's go back to the 15-year-old Jeanette. And we'll just skip a few letters. And she pulled out Gertrude Stein and gave her that. And, Gertrude Stein is still a good antidote to any young woman who finds Nabokov a little bit sleazy. And with the help of English literature from A to Z, Jeanette Winterson got to Oxford and became one of the most significant English writers of the century. When I think about readers, and I don't know if you're a reader, whether this chimes with you, but it sometimes strikes me that all of us have these slightly difficult childhoods, and the book has been our saviour, our consolation through quite difficult childhoods. I think about myself. I grew up in a fairly normal family in Canberra, but I never felt like the favourite, which is hard when you're an only child. But when I was 15, my mother ran away with my English teacher, who she'd met at parent-teacher. Which I don't know why, but somehow that makes it worse. And they went off, and my father was so heartbroken by this that he went back to England, at least for a time. He ended up moving a friend of his to look after me. But for a period, I was alone in this house in Canberra at age 14 or 15. And my friends loved it, this house without any adults in it. They all came tumbling over. And I used to whinge and whine, as you do when you're an adolescent. And I said, oh, it's terrible. My mother left, and then my father left. And one of my friends said, yes, Richard never really left home. Home left him. Which was kind of accurate. But during that period, I remember one particular moment when I was sitting reading my favourite book at the time, which was P.G. Wodehouse, the sort of gorgeous comedy of this sort of made-up English upper class of, Bertie Wooster and the Butler and Fink Nossel and Gussets and Auntie Agatha and all this marvellous stuff. And I was sitting on the edge of the school oval on my own reading this book. There's a picture form. And this other boy came up and he stomped on the book. He stomped on the book. And I was a weedy and effete young man, but nonetheless, I kind of jumped up, and I think still full of the world of P.G. Wodehouse, I jumped up and said, "You can't do that, you cad! Take this, you bounder!" I think it was the only time the word bounder has been used in a late 1970s Canberra playground ever. But I tell the story partly because it shows how much I'd become lost in the world, that this was my great consolation. I'd become totally lost. I'd gone to this totally other place. I was no longer sitting, a 14-year-old, 15-year-old boy who'd lost his family in a sense. I was no longer that person. I was in this other world and totally immersed in this other world. The book had been a trapdoor for me into which I could tumble and go into this other place. And it strikes me that so many of our favourite books have got literal trapdoors in them. You think of the Magic Faraway Tree, there's a literal trapdoor in it. Or even Doctor Who, there's a literal trapdoor. The Narnia books have got a literal trapdoor, which you enter into another world. Of course, not all books have a literal trapdoor, but they all, in a sense, are a trapdoor. Karenina hasn't got a trapdoor in it, but it still is a trapdoor into this other world through which you tumble. Now, why is that so important? Why is it so important for our minds and what it does for us? And I think part of it is it's an antidote to narcissism. This empathy that it delivers us is an antidote to narcissism. We talk a lot about the current age where this is not only about young people, it's about all of us. I think we're all addicted to social media and to Facebook and to Twitter and to MSN messaging and to YouTube. And we end up creating, the trouble about, they're great things, of course, and we can create great virtual communities through them. But they're also essentially narcissistic. You create a world in which you are at the centre and everything circles around you. You create a world made up of your own friends, your favourite bands, people who agree with you politically. It's like a pre-Copernican world in which you're at the centre and the rest of the universe rotates around you. And of course, this does chime in an awful way with the usual narcissism of adolescence. When I was that 14-year-old boy, totally involved in myself and my own problems, you kind of end up staring in the mirror and becoming self-obsessed. Like Narcissus himself looking into the mirror, you become totally obsessed with yourself. And the trouble about self-love is it's so rarely reciprocated. It turns on you, doesn't it, self-love? And the great advantage of the book is it's not about yourself at all. It's this tumbling into somebody else's point of view. Now, it turns out, I think, that the book not only does this for us as individuals, helping us out of these difficult parts of our lives, giving us perspective on ourselves, tricking us out of narcissism into empathy, it does this for whole societies. There's a really interesting book that's just been published recently by a Canadian social scientist called Steven Pinker, and it's called The Angels of Our Better Nature. And partly it's an argument about violence. A lot of people believe that violence is worse now than it's ever been, both in the microcosm and the macrocosm. Violence has risen over the centuries, and in more recent times, it's risen over the decade. Absolute bunkum, says Steven Pinker. And a lot of the book is this statistical demonstration of the fact that, in fact, both in recent times, the 1970s were more violent than the 2010s in Western cities around the world, but also over a bigger period of time, the violence, even in the awful 20th century, is nothing compared to the routine violence that you saw in the 13th and 14th centuries, when a small village would have a town square where people would be hung, where witches would be burnt, where bears would be baited, where criminals would have their hands cut off. All sorts of terrible things would happen. Violence was absolutely endemic in the society in a way that has been reduced over the centuries. And then, halfway through the book, after really demonstrating this with a series of graphs and statistics and anecdotes, Steven Pinker then says, why is that so? Why did it decline over those centuries? And here's where it gets interesting, because he overlays on all those graphs of violence a graph of the rise of literacy, a graph of the rise of the printing press, a graph of the rise of the number of readers, of the number of books published. And here's his theory. Again, it's back to reading being a gymnasium of empathy. That once you've read a fictionalised account, in other words, an account through somebody's eyes, an individual's eyes, of being burnt as a witch, once you've really read that, the flames licking up, the skin blistering, the screams renting the air, once you've read that, it becomes over time hard to participate in a society which is doing that. And so you get this engine of change through this emotional engagement with real people through fiction. Now, of course, he talks about Shakespeare in this context as being one of the first people who's getting actors up on the stage to invite audiences to see the world through an individual's eyes. And of course, the great Shakespeare plays are amazing in that they can have 20 characters on stage, and you're often seeing the world through all these different points of view simultaneously. Incredibly important figure in terms of this business of humanity learning it's training its muscles for empathy. And of course, we're now in the middle of a controversy about Shakespeare, aren't we? Courtesy of some books and articles and that film Anonymous, of course. This theory is about again, first mooted in the 19th century, that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. And it's such a bogan theory, I think. And it really rests, when you drill down into it, it really rests on this idea that Shakespeare couldn't write Shakespeare, the plays of Shakespeare, because he'd never travelled overseas. He was, not quite working class. He was the son of a glover, actually, and we know how intelligent they are. But he was kind of lower middle class, and he'd never had the chance to go overseas. So the theory is, well, how can he have written so beautifully about the world of Venice if he's never been there? And that's why it must have been the Earl of so-and-so, or the, whatever, the Viscount of who's-a-what. and various theories of various people who travelled overseas, and they must have written the plays of Shakespeare. And every book reader cries at rage at that point, because we know how he could manage to write about Venice so beautifully, never having been there. He read a book about it. And we know we suspect he went to Strathfield Grammar. We know that grammar schools of that time had very adequate libraries, and Shakespeare presumably tumbled into this world and read about it. And it comes down to, why I say it's a bogan theory, is it comes down to this idea of book learning. It's a big idea in Australia, isn't it? This mistrust of book learning. You have real learning on one side, and then you have book learning on the other. This sort of fake shadow of what real learning can do. And that is not the way I've experienced. And I think, what's interesting about that theory is actually book learning is what makes us special. That is really the thing that delineates us from the rest of the animals. That what any animal can have real learning, when the fox comes into the chook house and the chickens all go squawk to each other, let's get out of here, that is real learning. It's in the moment, they communicate to each other. All species do that. What human beings do that is so different is book learning. We have this ability to transfer our ideas over time and over place. That is what is exciting about us, that we can, open a book. I'm still sometimes entranced by the whole possibility of books. The idea that any one of us can go to a bookshop or download a book, and within 5 minutes we can be talking to Plato. We can really be talking to Plato. We can be entering into this dialogue with him. We can be tramping the Hindu Kush with Eric Newby. We can be walking pre-revolutionary Spain with Laurie Lee. This is a uniquely human ability to communicate over time. And that's all that Shakespeare was doing, was using that ability. And it seems shame that in celebrating Shakespeare, they forget what's powerful about book learning, that he demonstrates himself in his own work, this ability to, anyone seen a Shakespeare play knows that the experience of seeing one overwhelms the reality of the day that we've spent in the office leading up to that moment that we're in the theatre. That's the power of imaginative literature, and that's what it can totally do for you. The imaginative literature does this by exercising these muscles of empathy and by allowing us, as I say, to walk in somebody else's shoes. And that's what's so special about Shakespeare, and why I think book readers are so defiant in our protection of him and our understanding of what he managed to achieve. Which brings us back to this idea, I suppose, of the school child sitting on the school oval, that child that I was. And I think I was at the time very conflicted about how to be an Australian man at the time. I felt at the time that masculinity in Australia, this is late 70s, in Canberra, was a straitjacket that you put on rather than a smorgasbord of opportunities. That to be invited to be an Australian male was to be invited to have an attitude towards women, which I didn't have, and an attitude to sport, which I still don't have, and an attitude to drinking, which I'm catching up on. And I sort of didn't want any of that. And I got to the stage psychologically. One of my books, The Mud House, is really about this kind of process of learning about this. I got to the stage where I was in a youth theatre company, and this is a story of total madness, and I'm not telling this with any pride, where one of the young women said to me and Felix, could you two men move that rostra from here to there? And Felix and I just stared at her and we refused to move. We were aghast. Can you guess why? She'd called us men. And to our ears, that was like saying, could you two rapists please... And, obviously that's an example of kind of false consciousness, and you've got to get out of that. You've got to try to overcome that. And partly the story of my book, The Mud House, is a process by which I started building a mud house with a friend in the bush of Australia, and I kind of started to learn a way of being an Australian man that I quite liked. That there was a kind of role for masculinity, I suppose, of hammering in nails with a certain grim determination and pushing up buildings with a certain devil-may-care attitude. That wasn't, it was something that was shared with women, of course, but that was something special to two men. And at that time, we we both had our partners, our wives, our girlfriends, and we bought this block of land for $28,000, 100 acres. And right up in that kind of hilly, harsh country near Mittagong and the Wombian Caves. And it was incredibly cheap and incredibly beautiful and incredibly high. These beautiful blue skies and these gum trees that kind of shimmered with silver leaves. And we went up there and we decided to build mud brick because it was so cheap and we'd used up all our money, so this was a way we could start building straight away. And on the first day, we kind of swung the pick into the ground and swung the pick into the ground and discovered why the land was so cheap. It was just a fruitcake of rock. And by the end of about 3 hours, we had a large pile of rocks and a very small pile of dirt. But, nonetheless, we persevered. And how you make mud bricks is you make a sort of pool in the ground and you fill it up with this dirt and some straw and some water. And then you've got to kind of mix it like a cake. And Philip and I were sort of down there with our spades trying to move it around. And it's incredibly difficult to do, actually, because it's all sort of below ground level and we're all whinging and complaining on our backs hurt. And the women said, as women tend to do, stand aside. You're doing it all wrong. We'll do it. And Deborah and Gillian removed most of their clothing and got into the mud pit and kind of wrestled a little. And Philip and I stood back and we thought, two semi-naked women wrestling in mud and still producing a useful building material. Life doesn't get much better than that. And we've owned the land now for 30 years and they've never done it again. But through this sort of process, and I won't rehash the whole book to you, but during this whole process, I did feel I got a sense of how to be a man and how to find a way of embracing Australian masculinity that I thought was positive and enjoyable. And then, of course, when you dream of doing this, you dream of the moment when you'll finish the house and you'll be sitting there on the veranda drinking a beer and saying, we did all this. And this is exactly what happened. It took us kind of 20 years to finish the building. No power tools, all hand built. And at that point, my younger son was 14 and he said, this is so unfair because I haven't had a chance to be part of this building. We must build another place. By this time the back was sore and the checkbook was exhausted and I really didn't want to do it. But I say in the book, fathering is not only a noun, it's a verb. It's a doing word. And if an adolescent makes you that kind of offer at the beginning of adolescence, you've kind of got to do it. And Philip agreed. And so we started building this new building with Joe. And I love, again, this is about the human mind. When the human mind is still plastic and growing and 14 or 15 years old, it's such an exciting time. And there was a point where we'd really done nothing of the building. Joe had designed it in his mind, and we'd kind of marked out the area that it would be, but we hadn't laid foundations or really made proper building plans. And already in Joe's mind, the building was already there. And he decided that it was going to be called the Delphi Bar, and it was going to be a bar that would serve drinks to locals. There are no locals up there. You can be up there for a week and not see anybody. But his mind. So when we had friends who'd go overseas and he'd be saying, can you bring back some beer mats from Germany so I can decorate the bar? Or you're going to Singapore, what about some unusual beer bottles so I can decorate the bar? And this sort of madness climaxed in him on the bus home from school one day, stopping off at St Vincent de Paul and buying for $1.50 each 2 black waistcoats. Waiters' waistcoats for the waiters to wear in the bar that hadn't been built to serve drinks to the locals who don't exist. But he did keep on building and he recruited one of his friends and there was this glorious summer, which I think is the best chapter in the book, where the two of them, with that kind of frenzy of 15-year-olds, I think by then, made sort of 2,000 mud bricks every day, trying to beat the tallies that Philip and I had created all those years before, calling us wuzzers and you can't do it. And then there was this moment after they'd made the bricks where Philip started and I started making the kind of structure of the building. And there was this point where, I saw Joe and Phil up in the roof structure, with the tools, the tool belts and the drills and things like that. And I saw Philip teaching Joe how to be a man, in the same way that he taught me how to be a man, and with this kind of tenderness and generosity, and teaching him these useful skills of being masculine. And then I realised at that point that not to be too pretentious, but I talk about Jung in the book. I don't know if anyone's read Jung's autobiography. Reading Jung, Robert Kaplan could read Jung. I'm not very good at reading the actual case studies, but the autobiography is a great read. It's very easy to read. And he talks towards the end of building a house on the shores of Lake Geneva. And he sensibly uses tradesmen rather than doing it himself. But he says how, in the end, that house was himself written stone, his own soul written stone. Of course, mine was my own soul written mud, which is messier. But I did feel in the end that this house was a physical expression of everything, of my kind of two hardworking sons, of my own kind of journey towards healthy masculinity, of my friendship with Philip, of my gung-ho wife who'd helped build it. That I'd made the house, and then the house had returned the favour and made me. Which is just another story, really, about escaping narcissism, I think, of trying to look outwards rather than inwards. We're talking about the mind and its potential, and of course, the mind turned inwards has the potential for great damage, I think. The mind turned outwards to empathy and love has the opportunity to change the world. And what's interesting about all these stories, whether it's building or I could talk about bushwalking too, reading, is it's away from this inward-lookingness into love and empathy. And as Steven Pinker shows, it not only changes us, it changes the world. It's this engine, a gymnasium for empathy, but also an engine for social change. And maybe one of the most important is this ability of the mind to look outwards. I am going to go and sign my books later in the thing. If you want to buy one of them, you'd be most welcome. If you do buy one and take it home and find any grammatical mistakes in it, I don't want you to blame me, because if my mother hadn't run off with my English teacher... Thank you very much.